The Everything Apartments podcast is provided with support from the Apartment Association of Greater Los Angeles, better known as AGLA, serving residential landlords throughout Southern California through education and advocacy. Visit aagla.org. Welcome to the Everything Apartments podcast. I'm your host, Eric Christopher. And on this podcast, we cover all topics of multifamily investments, from buying and financing properties, day-to-day operations and management, and also reinvestment strategies. Many of you may know that in addition to having a management portfolio that we run here in Long Beach, I've also been a broker for 19 years next month, believe it or not. That was way before the gray hair when I got started in 2006, November 2006 at Marcus and Millichap. And I made a couple stops along the way at different shops before I started my own company here. Talking about the sales cycle, what we find when owners of, doesn't matter if it's apartments or commercial or even homes, consider selling a property, there tends to be a compelling reason why they do it. In kind of a joking fashion, it sort of revolves around either greed or pain. But to elaborate a little more on that, there are a few common reasons that kind of fit into a few buckets. The first one would be partnership dissolution, right? Whether it's a marital, familial, or just a straight business partnership, two or more parties just want to go their separate ways. And you can also maybe load into that when there might be a death in the family, of the patriarch of the family, and then the siblings are kind of left to decide what they want to do. That would kind of fall into the partnership dissolution also. And then there's the opportunity hunter. So perhaps an owner uncovers an opportunity that they see as a faster, better rocket to grow their cash flow and equity as opposed to the current asset they own. I have a listing and hopefully an upcoming listing that match two of those first ones. One's a pair of siblings who've held family real estate for many decades, kind of from a parental estate kind of situation, and they simply want to divest and go in their own direction. And the other one is a long-term owner of 30 plus years where the depreciation on the property is completely depleted. And he's identified an opportunity out of state with a much higher upside on a much newer building, much larger, and a fresh depreciation schedule to boot. And then there's owners that have held, say, less than favorable assets for a period of time. They made a solid attempt to kind of stabilize it. It just never really worked. I think we've all maybe experienced a property like that or two that just kind of lags behind the norm. Maybe if you have a few properties, there's just that one that just doesn't fit. May or may not want to hire an outside manager. But on a side note, we've been able to take a lot of those kind of scenarios under management with our firm WSC and put forth the effort and the expertise to get the owner on the track that they want to be on. But for now, let's just say they're done with the asset. Another reason could be the loan market. That's weighed in these last few years, changed a lot of equations for owners. Fixed rates that run out after the 5 or 7 year period. We've all seen those variable rates suck us in the stomach in the last few years. Many will hang in and refinance, but some may just be at the point in their life where they don't want to go through the exercise of refinancing, and it makes more sense to sell. So when I discuss selling with an owner, I really like to understand the reasoning and motivation behind it. That can help me help them better. Perhaps a 1031 exchange is in order, could be a different product type. For example, a passive income opportunity and a single tenant net leased investment. And then the DSTs, many of you know what those are, technically called a Delaware statutory trust. But that's another passive vehicle where you buy a fraction of a huge piece of real estate. Just as an example, like an Amazon distribution center could be owned by a DST, and you own a sliver of that. You load your remaining debt that you had on your apartment building into that, and it's another passive means. And we can strategize to find an equation that works. So once motivation and desire is understood, naturally the next question is, what is my sale price range going to be on the property that I'm relinquishing? So there's two main factors that drive that. First is the real estate market in general. Now, we all know real estate's a cyclical market, which shows some similarity over, say, a 10 to 15 year period. Are sales volume and pricing on an uptrend? Are they sort of flat on a plateau, or perhaps in a downtrend? I like to call this the tide, like the ocean tide. We as individuals have nothing to influence the ocean tide, in the same way that we have nothing individually we can do to influence the real estate market. Next is the property itself. And using the above analogy around the ocean tide, the property is kind of like the boat that's experiencing that tide. And I guess to take it one step further, you, the owner, are the captain of that boat. Now, a property stacks up in two main factors, and everybody's heard location, 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 but it is the undisputed champion of your property's value. And then the second fiddle is the characteristic of the asset. How old is it? What kind of condition it is? What kind of layout? So to give you that answer in what the property would achieve in the current market, we begin by analyzing the operations. And what I mean by that is we take the rent roll and the profit and loss statement. At this point, if we have 1 year, maybe like a full year to analyze, that's a good start. But start with the rent roll. What level are the rents at now relative to the market? That would increase the value by increasing the income. When was the last increase done? So unfortunately, some owners out there, they forget or they just want to keep their tenants in there and they don't raise the rents. They may be kind of stuck behind market for a while until they leave, but we like to know when was the last increase. How long has the tenant been there? That's kind of an important one for elasticity on raising rents. And is anyone delinquent or being evicted, and what's the scenario surrounding that? Next, we look at the profit and loss statement. Now, do the expenses appear within normal parameter? We'll analyze the discrepancies, maybe ask some questions and look at some statements as to why it might be different than we're used to. For a new owner coming in, many of the items will be the same as the seller. Obviously, water expense or perhaps insurance expense probably won't change from one owner to the other, but other things will. Obviously, property taxes is a big one. What we're trying to do with this analysis is put together a portrayal of what a new buyer would experience if they owned your property. Then we do a physical inspection of the property. And don't worry, I don't give the tenants any of the story if they ask me what I'm doing there. I've played the role of contractor or insurance agent getting a quote for the owner on these kind of inspections for decades, and I've never had a problem. So we do survey the exterior, just kind of see if there's any obvious deferred maintenance, what the characteristics are of the exterior, and that's half of it. Now, whenever possible, an interior tour helps the process a lot. The interiors are a huge part of a buyer's consideration, just like they would be if you were looking at a new property. The best thing we can do is, as we're doing this analysis, is schedule a routine periodic maintenance inspection, which is something you all should be doing anyway to avoid tenant issues, where I would come along for that inspection either with yourself or with your manager, and I would again go in as a contractor. Now, understandably, I've found sellers who opt away from this thing because they're a little fearful of the tenants knowing their business and what they're up to, but getting a visual on exactly what do the interiors look like ahead of when you take a potential buyer in there seems to be always a couple surprises that we might be able to avoid if we'd had done that pre-listing inspection. Once we arrive at a potential net income, size up the location and condition, then we begin to weigh the subject property against the comparable sales activity. That's what's closed, but also what's in escrow. Now, escrows are the most real-time data we have. They're literally in motion now. And it's really nice when we can find 2 to 3 similar properties in escrow at the time we're doing this analysis versus relying on sales that, depending on the quantity of sales, may have occurred over the last year, and the older ones may not be as relevant as the newer ones. More comparables is always better, and more escrows is always better. We also want to analyze similar properties that are on the market and for how long. This will represent our competition if we approach the market in the near term. So all these components, call them ingredients, are going to get mixed together for this final stew we are going to make. And that stew is in the form of a market evaluation and proposal for your property to go to market. Through my 19 years of experience analyzing hundreds of apartment properties like yours, you're in pretty good hands. What you see on the screen is the actual output we sit down over coffee with after we complete our analysis. I'll touch on this a little without going through every page, but basically in this package, the whole story of your property is portrayed. Now, this package sort of doubles as the listing proposal, but it'll quickly and easily morph into an offering memorandum. So if we get into a listing scenario, this would be my conversation piece with a potential buyer. So going through a few of these pages, we basically portray the property. This is a one-page summary that I could easily email or take to a meeting and just discuss preliminarily the property, obviously a map. We do a great job of getting some high-quality photography done on each property we list, including nowadays, it's almost a accepted standard to do drone photography on all your listings. Income summary. But that kind of is a summary versus this rent roll. Now, take a look at this rent roll. What I've done on the far right column, you can see that at this point in time, there's 5 of the units that are eligible. They passed their anniversary dates for rent increases. Now, if you look at those actual rents and say, okay, they may be at market or they may be below market. Knowing the market the way I do, I look at those 5 and I don't see that you couldn't increase them by the 8% max allowable right now. Now, the other thing that is interesting to look at is length of tenancy, which we also have. I was talking about that earlier. Now, length of tenancy is kind of important because somebody who's been somewhere for a year or maybe 2, they may still have a little bit of a flight risk in them if you raise their rent too high. What I found is after you get 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, after 5 years, that place is home to these people. And I do feel like you have a little more elasticity with raising their rents than somebody coming in off the street who's shopping. So a new tenant coming in is looking at 5 or 10 buildings, weighing price and features, whereby somebody who's been in the same place for 5 years, they've got to motivate to get up off the couch and go start shopping and fathoming moving all their stuff. So with the 5 that are in red there's a great chance you can raise their rent and they're not going to go anywhere. The next page is the projected operating statement. Now, what this again is it's a new buyer's projection. So just looking at the property taxes on this is a new property tax rate for a new purchase price versus the owner is probably half or less of that. So I'm portraying this in a new buyer's scenario. We got a really good loan quote on this at 70% LTV, under a 6% rate, fixed for 5 years. So that's heading the right direction. And then we get into the comparable sales. So I want you to notice I look at the same zip code and the same age of the properties. I want to make sure these are very tight and very relevant to what we're talking about. We basically have 3 that are closed, and those happened in the middle part of this year, so they're fresh enough. We have 3 that are under contract. Again, we love those. And then we have 3 that are on market. And the on markets are not ones that have been on for 12 or 18 months that don't really matter. And what we do here is we summarize the closed and under contract. We summarize the market on market. You always see a higher price for the on market than the under contract and closed. And then we put our subject property on the bottom just to have it in summary form. We then map out all the comparables so you can kind of see these are all in the same kind of zone of the same zip code of Long Beach. And then each one of them has a little more background information on the particular sale, how long it was on the market. I like to graph all the comparable sales. So as you can see on the left, the 6 are closed or under contract. The dark blue ones are the on markets, and the light blue on the far right is a subject property, just kind of where that's lining up to the peer group, if you will. And then we do the same thing for price per unit, and we do the same thing for price per square foot. Now, in most cases, sellers do have a value kind of cemented in their brains, and naturally, that's usually higher than the market. And I get it. I mean, many of us have poured our blood, sweat, and tears into these places, and mentally, the market needs to pay us for that, right? All kidding aside, I can count on one finger the number of times a seller told me that our proposed price was higher than they thought. And this also happens partly because the broker community has this accepted standard of what I call puffery. And all that is they'll tell you anything you want to hear for sale price to get your attention. They've got no problem kind of filling your head with vapor on the potential price. They want to get in the door, get you listed, and hope you're going to acquiesce when you see the real market comes to you. And believe me, I've lost a lot of business over almost 2 decades because I don't do that. I bring you the straight story from the beginning. And, the reality really lies in this analysis. The reality really lies in the comps that have sold. And if somebody's coming to you saying, hey, look, we can get you X dollars for this building, these people come at you and give you these pie in the sky prices. First thing out of my mouth would be show me the comps, because what we're doing is we're using what's going on in the actual market right now to give you a realistic projection versus pie in the sky. So to finish out our discussion, let's say the analysis and the proposed price lines up with seller expectation just well enough to move forward. We'll get the paperwork together and begin to construct the marketing plan. How will we present your property to the market? We will dig into that and the following stages of selling the property in the next episode of the Everything Apartments podcast. property sales series. Thank you for joining us, and we'll talk to you soon.